Hello everyone, my name is Erin McLuhan. I'm a registered nurse, and I'm also in my final year of law school at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This presentation centers around off-label drug regulation. Before we dive into the law here, I'd like to discuss some background info to give us context. Back in March of 2020, a lupus patient's healthcare network denied her hydroxychloroquine prescription due to the COVID-19 pandemic, telling her that this was necessary, quote, to conserve the current supply for those who are critically ill with COVID-19. And if that wasn't problematic enough, they added, "Thank you for the sacrifice you will be making for the sake of those that are critically ill. Your sacrifice may actually save lives." So from that point, many patients across the US started to experience drug shortages, arbitrary supply limits, and other hurdles in getting their scripts filled. The cause? Well, state health licensing boards reported that healthcare providers, including dentists and ophthalmologists, were writing these scripts, and not just for their own patients, but also for themselves and their friends and their family members as treatment and prophylaxis for COVID-19, despite all valid scientific data that showed HCQ was an ineffective COVID treatment. So how did health licensing boards respond? And we're talking about medical and pharmacy boards here, and I'm going to refer to them as HLBs from here on out. So they responded in one of three ways. First, by issuing no publicly available guidance at all, which fortunately was the smaller minority approach. Second, by issuing prescribing and dispensing recommendations to licensees, and this was the majority approach. And third, by issuing emergency rules limiting the prescribing and dispensing of hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19, and that was the larger minority. So before we get into the specifics of these responses, I want to quickly run through some essential legal principles. First, the federal government does not have the authority to regulate medical practice. That is exclusively within the state's police powers. Second, as we all know, healthcare is a highly regulated industry, but off-label prescribing is largely under-regulated. Essentially, once the FDA approves a drug for one indication, legally it can be used for any indication as long as that use does not violate the standard of care. And several courts have held that providers don't have to disclose that they're prescribing a drug off-label, which historically hasn't been that big of a deal, because most providers are making sufficiently evidence-based prescribing decisions even when they're writing a script off-label. But we are starting to see the impact of rising anti-science bias and misinformation on public health and in medicine, and that's something that we can't forget moving forward. So knowing that our feet are firmly planted in state law territory, the central question becomes, why are HLBs in the best position to regulate off-label prescribing, particularly during public health crises? Well, one, they have the authority, through Medical Practice and Pharmacy Practice Acts, to regulate and set standards for their professions. They also have a statutorily imposed duty to protect the public health of their states. And finally, they have the expertise. They regulate drug access in other ways, like imposing prescribing and dispensing limits on opioids, for example. So, how do HLBs balance this need to preserve medical resources while also not stifling clinical innovation and physician autonomy? The answer is by issuing targeted, evidence-based regulations. This includes rules requiring sufficient documentation. We saw several state boards requiring a positive COVID test to be attached to all HCQ prescriptions for COVID treatment to cut down on its use as prophylaxis. The other thing some state boards did was institute supply limits on all HCQ orders. So, for example, no more than 714 days worth could be ordered or dispensed at a given time. But the issue with that approach was many states did not make an exception for patients who took HCQ in their ordinary course of care, which obviously backfired. So my recommendation was for states to make an exception for patients who use the drug for non-COVID indications. And some state boards flat out prohibited the prescribing and dispensing of hydroxychloroquine for COVID prophylaxis until sufficient evidence existed to support such use, which, of course, is one of the central issues here. Sufficiency of evidence. What is sufficient? Who gets to determine that? And do we give the government more of a say when we're under crisis conditions? Lastly, why does this even matter? Not to be a Debbie Downer, but infectious disease experts are warning that pandemics will become more common as our global population grows. So today it's hydroxychloroquine for COVID, but tomorrow it could be some other medication for another pandemic-prone infectious disease. The point is that HLBs play an essential role in pandemic preparedness, and unfortunately, protecting chronically ill patients and their life-sustaining medications from misinformation is now on the agenda. So, what are your thoughts? Do you think these measures are appropriate? Are they going too far? Not far enough? Disagreements are welcomed and encouraged. I had a lot of fun researching this issue, so if you'd like to learn more, please contact me and I'd be happy to discuss this with you. I could also send you my law review article after it's published. It should be out in a few weeks. Likewise, if you know anyone who's interested in drug regulation, particularly at the state level, feel free to send them my way. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.